December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It is a quiet Sunday morning, and soldiers stationed here are just beginning to rise. The streets of nearby Honolulu are quiet. Soon, however, the quiet will be shattered by an event that will change the very course of history, as well as the lives of countless millions of people the world over. It will go down in history as one of the most despicable acts of unprovoked aggression perpetrated by one nation upon another. The name Pearl Harbor will become virtually synonymous with the concept of the surprise attack. In the immediate aftermath, and for decades to come, the facts surrounding the attack and the events that led to it will be discussed and debated, fingers pointed, blame assigned. Today, few believe the American government should have and could have been completely surprised by it. For both America and Japan, the road to Pearl Harbor was long, but straight. And the date that will live in infamy was almost 100 years in the dawning.
Many American-owned ships have been sunk on the high seas. One American destroyer was attacked on September 4th. Another destroyer was attacked and hit on October 17th. 11 brave and loyal men of our Navy were killed by the Nazis. Today, in the face of this newest and greatest challenge of them all, we Americans have cleared our decks.
We figured that they'd go to war with Germany first, and most guys thought that they would declare war on Germany to help England, since they were helping England so much. The guys in the Atlantic was already at war with Germany. The destroyers, it was convoying these supply ships to England. I mean, they were fighting an undeclared war in the North Atlantic up there with the German U-boats. And they just thought about Japan over there. They was tied up with China and wasn't a whole lot going on there, and nobody dreamed that they'd ever attack the United States, or at least ones I knew didn't.
The planes and submarines that attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii were, in a very real sense, launched 88 years earlier. In 1853, 4 American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry dropped anchor in the fortified harbor of Uraga. Perry demanded that he be allowed to deliver a message from President Fillmore to the ruling shogunate. Although he was granted an audience, he was unable to convince the Japanese to open their ports to U.S. ships. He returned the following year, this time with 7 ships, and repeated his demands. Faced with Perry's persistent diplomacy and a clear display of naval superiority, the shoguns had no choice but to yield. At the time, Japan was a world unto itself, having isolated itself from political, commercial, and religious influence from beyond its shores for more than 2 centuries. Now, the barriers had been irrevocably breached. Just 3 years later, American Consul Townsend Harris was escorted into the audience room of what is now the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, then known as Edo, to begin negotiations that would lead to a full-fledged trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Ironically, the date of Harris's arrival was December 7th, 1857. The effect of this sudden change on Japan was enormous, due in large part to their inability to maintain Japan's policy of isolation. The shogunate was overthrown within a decade and the emperor was returned to power. However, what seemed like capitulation to the Western world was, in fact, altogether different, and beyond the scope of the Westerners' understanding. In opening herself to other cultures, Japan was actually preparing to dominate them. Even before the fall of the shoguns, Japanese leadership began to plot maneuvers that would place them in a position of power both in Asia and the world. As one Japanese counselor put it, the nations of the world will come to look up to our emperor as the great ruler of all nations, and they will come to follow our policy and submit to our judgment. This was, in fact, a restatement of the policy of Hakko-Ichu, articulated 1,200 years earlier by Emperor Jimmu. Bring all the corners of the world under one imperial roof. Simply put, rule the world.
Well, I was called up to the exec's office right after the attack and things slowed down. We had about, if I recall, 5 or 6 bodies up there lined up. Now bear in mind, I was regular Navy. I wasn't a draftee. I was in over a year before the draft ever started. And I looked at these fellows, and this one guy, his name was Leach, a quartermaster, who I thought was Leach. I looked at him, I had known Leach. He was on the quarterdeck. I crossed the quarterdeck 3 or 4 times a day. It was just close to our shop. I saw no visible signs of injury on him, no place, but I looked at him, I identified him as Leach, the quartermaster. The next day, Leach came aboard. He was one of them was blown over the side, or a lot of them dove over the side when the executive ordered to abandon the ship because we were going down. So what the bomb had did to some of these people was just hard to describe, because on this one guy that I've known him for at least a couple of years, and I described him, and it wasn't him at all.
The early 20th century found the United States in a race with the rest of the world for influence in the Pacific. America, England, Russia, France, Holland, and Japan all vied for territorial holdings in the region. Having wrested the Philippines and Guam from Spain, the U.S. also controlled Midway, Samoa, and the Hawaiian Islands. In addition, all of these nations were competing for power in China. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion led to the killing of missionaries, diplomats, and other foreigners living in China, and opened the door for other nations to send in an expeditionary force of 19,000 soldiers. In the treaty that resulted, Britain was the clear winner, and although it would maintain a military presence, the U.S. had clearly lost influence in China. This fact, coupled with having her resources in the Pacific consumed at an unexpected rate trying to put down an independence movement in the Philippines, induced the U.S. to order all its territories in the Pacific closed to foreign investment. The Japanese, in particular, took offense to this move but said nothing. In 1905, Japan had become the first Asian power in modern times to defeat a European power in armed conflict when it defeated Russia at Port Arthur. This, coupled with the 1894 defeat of China in a battle for influence in Korea, made it clear that the Japanese were the preeminent power in Asia. To achieve all this, after existing for centuries as a closed, feudal society, had taken Japan fewer than 50 years. She was now a thoroughly modern nation, but she had achieved her success by following an ancient code. In her two great military victories, Japan had made good use of an old martial principle of the samurai. Win first, fight later.
Well, an evening seemed like another war, because as the night drew by, you weren't allowed to light any matches, and all the vehicles had all their lights painted down to size of a pea hole, where the light came through, they can see, let somebody know that they're coming. And there was a lot of sporadic shooting going on that evening, and we couldn't figure out why or where it was coming from or what's happening. But the next morning when we got up, we found out that the soldiers that went on duty, patrolling and so forth, we found out that there was a lot of animals killed, mules, horses, dogs, because anything that moved that night, when you hollered halt, who goes there? And something moved and you didn't say nothing, you were dead.
When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Japan's decades-old treaty with England compelled her to join the fight on the side of the Triple Entente. Japan took the German colony of Kiaochao in the Chinese province of Shantung, then in quick succession the Mariana, Marshall, and Caroline Islands. Japanese warships cruised the Pacific looking for German ships but never engaged any. All the while, Japan worked to consolidate her territorial gains, signing secret agreements with all the major powers except the United States. The surrender of Germany restored peace to the world, but the treaty did little more than set the stage for future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, which the United States refused to sign, allowed Japan to keep almost all her possessions. The United States, on the other hand, had steered for itself a course of isolationism on which it would remain for 20 years. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Japan continued to chip away at the Chinese province of Manchuria. Open war between the two nations finally came in 1936. For 5 years, China's appeals to the United States fell on isolationist ears.
America tests the mightiest bomber ever built. $3.5 million worth of fighting plane takes to the skies. With its 8,000 horsepower and wing spread of 210 feet, the B-19 passes with colors flying, a symbol of air supremacy to come. Merchantmen, destroyers, battleships, cruisers slip down the ways as part of the huge program for a two-ocean navy. 690 ships have been ordered. Among these, the USS North Carolina, mightiest battleship afloat, America's grim challenge to marauders of the sea. Its salvos roar, beware! At night, its guns blaze in spectacular majesty.
On December 12, 1937, the gunboat USS Panay was cruising the Yangtze River, providing a protective shield for U.S. citizens and diplomats living in the region. At 1:38 in the afternoon, under clear skies, just hours after having been stopped, boarded, and released by a Japanese motor launch, the Panay was attacked by Japanese bombers. At the time of the attack, the Panay had a pair of 250-square-foot American flags draped over its awnings. The bombing and strafing continued for 20 minutes, during which time Panay took 12 direct hits and sank. When it was over, 3 sailors were dead, 45 were wounded.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world.
Despite evidence to the contrary, the Japanese government declared the attack a mistake. Outraged, President Roosevelt demanded that there be a serious reprisal for the action, but the isolationist tendencies of Americans proved too strong and the Congress did not act.
But I've always thought that, and when we go into the schools and talk to the school kids, we always stress the fact that the Japanese made 4 mistakes. The first one is they didn't bomb the Navy Yard. And immediately we had Navy Yard workmen come in that night, start putting these ships back together. They didn't bomb the submarine base. And our submarines sank 90% of the shipping that was sunk in the Pacific. They didn't bomb the oil storage tanks. That left us an unlimited supply of fuel, and they didn't bomb the powerhouse. So we had an unlimited supply of power to operate the machinery in the Navy Yard. And really, the only damage they did, they sunk a bunch of obsolete battleships. They didn't get any of our carriers because none of our carriers was in port. And if they'd have sunk any of those carriers, the war might have lasted a whole lot longer.
The day following the sinking of the Panay, Japanese troops attacked the Chinese city of Nanking. Once in the city, Japanese commanders let their troops run wild through the streets. In what would become known as the Rape of Nanking, over the next several weeks, they systematically looted and burned the city and surrounding towns, destroying more than a third of the buildings. Japanese soldiers raped, tortured, and murdered the citizens of the city. In the end, more than 40,000 Chinese were killed. Following the Nanking massacre, the U.S. government placed a so-called moral embargo on shipments of scrap iron and steel to Japan. By 1940, the Japanese government had set itself on a course that seemed certain to lead to war with the United States. The conquest of Manchuria was complete, and a puppet government installed which took its orders from Tokyo. Chinese citizens were forced into slave labor in support of the Japanese advance into the rest of China. In addition, in an effort to secure the natural resources it needed to fuel its aggression, it had seized control of a number of Pacific islands, and the spoils of these conquests began to make their way to factories in Japan. Still, they needed more. Despite their successes, the offensive in China had stalled, with little progress being made since 1938. With Hitler and Mussolini firmly in control of the European continent, an alliance with these sworn enemies of Britain and America seemed only natural. In September 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact. The windfall of this agreement was that it cleared the way for an invasion of another source of natural resources, French Indochina.
Somewhere in the Atlantic, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill meets President Roosevelt. A hand clasp that ushers in one of the most dramatic conferences between the leaders of nations ever recorded. Here, the next day, the Atlantic Charter with its 8 points is formulated. As they part, hopes for a permanent peace rise in the hearts of the two great democracies of the world. $16 million man-days lost by strikes that slacken America's mighty defense effort. Throughout the nation, the wrath of the mob vents itself on non-sympathizers who attempt to pass mass picket lines. At widely scattered localities, police clash with strikers in hand-to-hand conflict. Tear gas bombs burst before the American aviation plant at Inglewood, California, as United States troops arrive to take over the factory and preserve order. They move in to assure uninterrupted production of vitally essential aircraft for America and its friendly nations at war.
With the Nazi-controlled Vichy government ruling over France and all of its territories, the Japanese demanded permission to station troops in Indochina. Ostensibly, these forces were to assure that there were no military goods passing over the border into China. At first, the Vichy French resisted, but soon gave way. Once these units were in place, movement to and occupation of the South was inevitable. In July 1941, Japanese forces operating under the thin veil of a French-Japanese Mutual Defense Pact entered South Indochina. The United States government was incensed and alarmed by this action. It clearly indicated a change of direction for Japanese aggression. If they could not advance north into China, they would move south toward Allied possessions, including the Philippines. President Roosevelt, already stoking the fires for a war with Germany, sought some form of retribution. The immovable isolationist views of the American public held fast, though, and military action was out of the question. Still, it was clear that Japan's aggression could not go unanswered. So the United States froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. This was a blow to the economically strapped empire, but the news got worse. In addition to freezing the assets, the United States placed an embargo on the shipment of oil to Japan. Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. Despite the fact the Japanese had stockpiled oil in anticipation of an embargo, they had only enough to last 18 months, and military leaders estimated the war in China would take 3 years to conclude. Clearly, the situation was becoming critical. Japan's government, angry with what it saw as unjustified interference in its own regional affair, viewed the oil embargo as an act of war. Among the Japanese high command, it was now taken as a matter of fact that if the situation with the United States could not be settled with diplomacy, it would have to be settled with military action. Tensions escalated rapidly.
Our captain, Kazan Young, he was on the quarterdeck just above where I was at. When the Arizona blew up, he was blown over the side. He swam back to the gangplank, or swam back to the ladder and climbed the ladder. The executive given orders to abandon ship because we were going down and the Arizona was pulling us down. There was just no way that we could battle any longer. But when he swam back aboard ship and back to the ship and climbed the ladder, he gave orders to beach the ship and got us underway, got a tug alongside, got us underway, and got us in shallow water before we went down. For that act, Captain Kazan Young was one of the 3 live people to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, if I recall correctly, and you can check on this, there was 14 people in Pearl Harbor who got the Congressional Medal of Honor. 11 of them were killed there. Captain Kazan Young was one of the 3 live people to stand up and receive the Congressional Medal of Honor on board our ship a month or 2 later. I forget just what month it was now. Then he transferred to the USS San Francisco and was killed the following November when the shell hit off the bridge off of Savo Island. Killed him and all of his staff except one man, a commander, McCandless, who brought the ship in. So he got to wear his medal for about 11 months, I guess.
Throughout the next few months of 1941, U.S. and Japanese diplomats negotiated in earnest. Japan asked the United States to lift the oil embargo, which the United States refused to do unless Japan agreed to halt its aggression against China. The United States regarded Japan's adamant refusal to budge on their stance as a sign of hostility. Like the Japanese leaders, Roosevelt and others came to realize that war with Japan was inevitable. Accordingly, the U.S. began fortifying the bases in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur began to organize his ground forces in the Philippines into a formidable army. His confidence in his troops grew daily, as did his determination to meet any Japanese attack head-on. As the diplomats continued to talk, both nations were preparing for war. By this time, the United States Pacific Fleet, which usually operated out of California, had already been in Pearl Harbor for more than a year. Hawaii was seen as the perfect location for the American forces in the Pacific because of its location, halfway between the United States West Coast and the Japanese military bases in the Marshall Islands. This forward presence posed a formidable threat to the Japanese. If Japan was to continue its expansion, the fleet at Pearl Harbor would have to be dealt with. In February, the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet got a new commander, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. He had many characteristics in common with Yamamoto, although he lacked the Japanese commander's charisma and creative imagination. Kimmel graduated from Annapolis in 1904, the same year Yamamoto graduated from Etajima. Kimmel revealed a remarkable talent for gunnery, and many of his early assignments were connected with that field. In May 1925, Kimmel was selected to attend the Naval War College. Soon after graduation, he was promoted and sent to the Navy Department in the Policy and Liaison Division. After 3 years there, he returned to sea in command of a destroyer squadron. His next command was captain of the battleship New York, which was followed by an assignment back in Washington as the Navy's budget officer. In 1938, he returned to sea in command of a cruiser division with the rank of Rear Admiral. Within a year, he stepped up to commander, Cruiser Battle Forces. This stainless career involved no experience with naval aviation. In February 1941, he assumed command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet with the rank of Full Admiral. Kimmel was devoted to the offensive. He never visualized his fleet as taking a defensive posture. Throughout 1941, he worked himself and everyone else to the verge of exhaustion to prepare for the day all knew was coming, when his ships would sail forth to engage the enemy. After the debacle at Pearl Harbor, ironically enough, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's ships and men were generally conceded to have never been in better fighting trim than under Kimmel's leadership. Events pushed Kimmel into command of the fleet a year earlier than planned. His predecessor, Admiral James Richardson, was fired after opposing the White House on disposition and training of the fleet. He was canned after only 1 year, but not before he had established two dangerous precedents. He put the fleet on an operating schedule so fixed that its movements were readily predictable, and he considered torpedo nets around the ships an unnecessary precaution. General Walter Short, Army commander in Hawaii, was atypical for a general officer. He was not a West Point graduate. Since receiving a direct commission in 1902, he had served in posts from the Philippines to Alaska and was with Pershing in Mexico. He was competent and conscientious, but oddly enough, although George Marshall had spelled out to Short in unmistakable terms that the Hawaiian Department's primary duty was to protect the fleet in Hawaii, Short looked upon the fleet as protection for the island and believed that the Japanese would attack, if at all, only when the fleet was well out to sea. This mistaken attitude left U.S. Air Forces sitting on the runway wingtip to wingtip on that fateful morning.
With the stroke of a pen, President Roosevelt sets in motion the nation's machinery for drafting all men between the ages of 21 and 35. October 16th, on this day, millions of American youth in every corner of the nation register for military service. History repeats itself. A World War drama is reenacted. The same fishbowl from which capsules were drawn for the wartime draft of 1917 again serves for the country's first peacetime call. Millions for artillery. Millions for tanks and anti-tank guns. Millions for airplanes, thousands of them, while American plants are turning out other thousands for Britain. American Army airmen were the first to experiment with parachutes for war, years before Russia and Germany made use of them in actual conflict. As Japan casts its lot with the Axis powers, the United States speeds the building of its first two ocean navies.
By October of 1941, the Japanese had concluded that they would have to go to war with the United States. As diplomatic negotiations continued, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese fleet, was instituting a plan to immobilize the U.S. fleet with a surprise attack. Despite some opposition by the General Staff, soon extensive training exercises were underway. Yamamoto's bold plan called for the use of 6 heavy aircraft carriers carrying 300 planes and accompanied by 24 supporting vessels as well as a fleet of submarines. The primary targets of the attack were to be the American aircraft carriers. Intelligence indicated that although groups of ships regularly left the port to engage in exercises, most of the time the entire fleet was docked in the harbor. All available modes of bombing were to be used in the attack, and the attack force had to be equipped to refuel the attack aircraft at sea. In order to assure success, all U.S. aircraft would have to be destroyed to prevent aerial opposition. Furthermore, a strong fighter element would be included in the attack as air cover for the Japanese carriers. Finally, the attack would be most effective if it could be carried out in daylight. Yamamoto preferred sunrise. With training completed, the carrier task force under the command of Chuichi Nagumo left Japan under a veil of radio silence. U.S. intelligence followed its movements for a time, but lost track before its destination could be determined. The die had been cast. On December 5, 1941, General Douglas MacArthur, who had continued his preparations for an attack on the Philippines, said, "Nothing would please me better than if they would give me 3 months and then attack here." He was to get neither wish.
I can recall the faces of those fellows, and I can recall, not in recent years, but I have had dreams in the past, and I could look in the eye when I tell you this, where airplanes would be flying over in huge numbers, and you're running, you're out in the open, and you're running, you're trying to find cover, and you jump off a cliff. I've done this in my dreams. And you're going down and down and down, that's when you wake up. That has been an experience in my dream, and I'm sure this is not new to fellows who are in the service. I'm sure that many of them could tell you more hairier experiences than I could ever begin to tell you, and I understand that. But I'm sure that their stories in reference to something like this would be like mine. They have relived their experiences many, many times, yes.